ongoing requests from residents to get more information about what this long-term contamination means to our health, both historic and now. And we continue to advocate for more information and, perhaps meetings or calls on that topic. Tonight, however, we're focused on those two reports, the playground and the waste, where it extends beyond the park boundaries. And we don't have a medical doctor or a public health person on the call tonight, but we do continue to push for a meeting like that to happen soon. So I'll have to ask folks to feel free to express concerns in the chat or share them with me by email for a future meeting, but we won't be able to have them answered appropriately tonight. This meeting is being recorded, and it will be posted afterwards on the Durham Parks and Rec website, so that you can go back and listen or share it with friends who weren't able to join tonight. So with that, I will turn it over to our presenter, Jerry Paul. He'll be presenting the material tonight. He's a senior project manager with S&ME, with a couple of decades of experience in environmental consulting. And he's been working on the Durham Park sites for some time. Jerry, I'll turn it over to you and for the presentation on playgrounds, and feel free to introduce yourself further if I didn't do a good job.
No, you did great, Daniel. Thank you. I'll go ahead. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start the presentation. I just want to make sure everyone can see it online. It seems like there was a little issue with folks connecting. And like Danielle said, we're going to kind of go through these two reports and kind of explain them. If anyone feels like I'm going too fast, or I'm not really explaining anything well, please let me know, slow me down. I only have a few slides for each one of the reports, and then we can kind of verbally talk about the findings. And what we will do is, like Daniel said, we're going to start off covering the playground sampling report, and then we'll do a question and answer session. So we'll kind of take a break and let you ask whatever questions you need to there. And then we'll talk about the waste delineation reports, and then we'll do another Q&A session after that. So let me go ahead and get started here. Share the screen. You just let me know when you can see the presentation. Anyone's fine.
Yes, Jerry, we can see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
Good deal. Okay. Here we go. All right. Daniel mentioned that we're not going to really get into the public health aspects of the sampling for the parks, but DEQ wanted me to kind of present this slide, and I basically put a QR code on here if you don't want to take a screenshot of this web link, and then there's also a phone number here. Like Daniel said, the whole presentation is going to be recorded, so you'll be able to go back to this. But if you wanted to break out your phones now and scan that QR code, it can take you directly to the Department of Health and Human Services website, where you can get more information and ask additional questions. So like I said, we're going to start with the sampling reports for the parks first. So I'm going to kind of talk about the pre-reg landfill program a little bit. The program has recommended closure of the playgrounds until the investigation as a whole is complete. Kind of want to say something here briefly, and I know I've been working on these landfills since they were pushed over to the pre-reg landfill group, so it's been going on 2 years. And I also watch the news, and I know that there's a lot of public awareness. Folks are really wanting something to be done. I want to share we're going to share these reports, but I also want it to be clear that there's a lot more involved in what we're doing for our investigations than what initially started this whole thing. At the beginning of this, the focus was on lead contamination in the soils. Once they got pushed over into the pre-reg landfill program, it took on a whole life of its own, because there are many more possible contaminant sources that we need to investigate. Those include groundwater contamination, soil contamination from many different constituents, surface water, sediment, and vapors that could be coming from these landfills. So it's not an excuse, of why this has taken so long, but we are investigating 5 parks at the same time, and we're trying to make sure that we cover all of our bases before we go and we present a remedial action. And that's when something will physically be done to the park to remedy the situation. We need to know all of the different contaminants that are involved from the landfills. So we're well on our way, much further along than these 2 reports are going to show you. Right now and throughout the summer, we're doing detailed investigations on all of those media types that I mentioned: groundwater, surface water, and soil gas. So I just wanted to make that clear. Now, when we talk about the playgrounds and the sampling that we found, another point I want to make clear: 2 things. One, the playgrounds are all located within the boundaries of the waste disposal area. And I know we're going to talk about the waste disposal area later in the delineation area, but it's important to know that unfortunately all the playgrounds happen to be where the waste is located. And 2, when we did the sampling of the playgrounds, we identified waste in all of the playgrounds in some capacity. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through each park and each site at a time. So what I did, I pulled out a figure from each one of the reports, and the figures pretty much tell the story. There's a lot more to our detailed reports, which talk about the chemicals that were detected and the different levels. But our initial findings showed that we broke the playground down into these smaller sampling grids. And each one of these sampling grids that's shaded in red indicates that it was above the EPA's regional screening level for lead. That means it exceeded 200 parts per million for lead. The grids that are not covered in red and they just have this black hatching, that just indicates that there was waste exposed in that top foot of the soil that we sampled. So there was waste in all the parks, and you can see from this playground there was waste in every one of the sampling grids. But then some of the other sampling grids actually had levels of lead that exceeded that 200 threshold. And you'll find that as we go through each one of these parks and each one of the playgrounds that that's the case. In this case, in this picture, you can see that the old incinerator was right next to the playground. Again, I'm going to kind of get ahead of myself talking about the delineations. But what you would think that you would find is that the incinerator is located here, therefore the waste is all going to be located near the incinerator. And when we get to those delineation reports, you'll see that the waste is spread in various ways that doesn't really make sense in some cases. It's round, it's oblong, but it doesn't always fit that, that it's all kind of consolidated. We don't know when these landfills were kind of put in place, what the logic was behind it. We don't know if they were trying to fill low spots in the property, we don't know. We're trying to kind of go backwards in time from what you can see today, which is a nice flat open area, and identify where that waste was buried. We don't know the why, so through our investigations, we're trying to kind of pin down all of the areas where it's located. So this was East Durham. This is Lion Park. Lion's got 2 smaller playgrounds, and as you can see right off the bat, none of those sampling grids exceeded the RSL for lead of 200, but there was waste located in 6 of the 8 grids. And then when I get to those delineation reports, you'll see that this entire area here is within the footprint of some of the waste that we located around the property. This is
Hey, Jerry.
Yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
You're fine.
But can you clarify for the good of the group what you mean by waste?
Incinerator waste. So when the incinerator burned the trash back in the day, and I actually have a couple pictures in my presentation to kind of show you what the waste looks like. It's not like your typical landfills today where the waste is plastic and fabric and cloth that's all buried and just compressed. When it went through the incinerator, it burned a lot of the waste material, and what was left over is incinerator ash. And in most cases, it's now mixed with the soil, or it has the consistency of soil. So it really looks very similar to the soil that's out in the parks, but it's darker in color. It's more of a black color. And then you can see some of the waste fragments that did not burn off, the ceramic, glass, brick, and some of those things. But most of the original fabric and paper type products have already burned off. So when we say waste disposal area, when we did our delineations, we looked for those ash-like materials. So, and again, I'll show you a picture of those and that'll help clarify a little bit later. This is the East End Park. There are two playgrounds here. This is a much smaller one. It's near the building here, and it's surrounded by concrete. That one exceeded the RSL for lead at 200, and these 4 grids here did not. But again, there was waste located in all 4 of those samples as well. Walltown, same thing. It's within the footprint of the waste disposal area. Most of these grids did not fail for lead. However, there's glass and brick fragments located in the waste and under the playgrounds. And this is Northgate. The only difference between Northgate and the other parks, and I don't want to get too much into the details here, but once we analyze the samples and we're identifying what contaminants are in the samples, we look for some of the outliers like lead. And so lead is kind of bolded on the figure to show that it exceeds the RSL. But we take those other chemicals and we run them through. DEQ has a program called a risk calculator. And we take all of those different chemicals and we put it into the risk calculator at those lower levels. And it tells us, based on the cumulative effect of those chemicals, if there's a risk that's beyond that needs to be addressed. And so that's what that purple grid there indicates. It did not exceed for lead, but the cumulative effect from all the chemicals, it did exceed the risk calculator. And that's the summary of the 5 parks, sorry. And then these are the pictures of the waste itself. You can see these are the 2 samples. I kind of separated them. This is what's usually left over from the burning process. So you can see small fragments of ceramic plates and glass and brick. I believe these were taken from the Northgate Park. And then when you're just looking at the waste material as it's mixed in with the soil, this is what it looks like. And if you didn't know any better, you would just think that's a dark organic soil. But the Durham parks sit in an area that's called the Triassic Basin. And typically what you see in the Triassic Basin are bright orange and reddish silts. And so it's pretty easy for us when we're looking down and through borings or through trenches to kind of see this waste. And that's how we delineate it. And again, we'll kind of talk about that later. And that's really it for the first section from the playground sampling report. So now we'll kind of open it up for questions if you want to.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay, you said about East End Park,
Yes, sir.
and the one I'm definitely most concerned about is one over by the building, which is known to us and to the city that it not only it has mold. Did y'all consider looking into the mold part of that building into the earth part of those parks?
For our investigations, we're not focused on the buildings, on the structures. We're focused on the landfills themselves, so the ground surface. So everything we're looking at is everything below the ground surface and at the ground surface. So the buildings are kind of treated separately. They're not part of the landfills. So no, sir, we did not investigate the buildings.
There's a
That would
question
be
for Danielle Wagner. Sorry, Mr. Tavis, did that answer your question? Okay. We'll come back to you if there's any follow-up. Danielle Wagner asks, was
Did you
the
hear me?
waste? Yes.
Okay, he did answer my question. I just want to know, was that part of the sampling he was doing?
no, sir.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right.
Was the waste deposited before or after the parks were developed? And then the second part of your question was about asking about residential soil near the parks, which we'll get to in a few minutes. So was the waste there before the parks were developed?
We don't know. I mean, based on the fact that all of the parks seem to have some sort of soil cover over the waste, I would believe that the waste was there and the parks were placed after, but we really don't know. That would be more of a question for the city and the historical records that they have.
We do know that these all the majority of these parks were incinerators. They were city dumps before they were developed, for decades before they were developed into the recreation areas that they are now. If that helps with the question. In the case of Northgate Park, there's historical record that hundreds of truckloads of waste from Walltown Park was deposited in lower lying areas of Northgate Park, which is how some of the contamination went there. Northgate Park never had an incinerator site.
Correct.
It looks like Stella has a question. If you want to unmute yourself.
Yes. I have done a historical record for redlining, and all of the parks were in the redlined areas of Durham, and these incinerators existed at the time, many of them at the time that the maps were developed. And so this contamination has been in these communities for decades, and it's very troubling to me because I know that the community had, prior to the 2 years you've actually been investigating, I know that there were efforts to get a full investigation of the soil, not just the lead, at least 4 years ago. And so that the parks are still contaminated, that we were told our children were safe to play in those parks, when many of us felt it was already a brownfield and should have been more thoroughly investigated. 4, not 2, 4 years ago is extremely frustrating. And I did not realize that my children have grown up playing in Northgate Park their entire life, exposed to this contamination, which, you know, may explain some of the health issues that we are facing. Very frustrated.
Thank you so much for that very important context. For it's really critical for people who are just engaging with this issue. But it's really sort of, yes.
If there's someone else got another question, I want you to answer get that question now.
There
If not,
is. Yeah,
ahead
thank
on.
you so much. We'll give there is another question in the chat asking if you can clarify which parks were formerly had incinerators and which parks did not, of the 5.
So East Durham, and you can see them on the figures here, and also in the reports that were issued by DEQ. So East Durham Park, Lyon Park, and East End. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan. I think Walltown had one. I think Northgate is the only one that did not, and had the historical records of waste being trucked out there. I believe that's the case. So I think 4 out of the 5 had
That's
incinerators.
correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Northgate, as you can, we'll when we get into the delineation report, you can kind of see where that waste is located. And I've kind of, I'll go into a little spiel that I've got, but I think I can explain most of what those historical documents show, because our findings are pretty similar to what they showed.
Great. There's a few more questions.
Yep.
Probably one of the top questions is when is there some sort of concrete timeline for opening up the parks? I'm sorry, for opening up the playgrounds, so not the whole park, but for opening up the playgrounds or other areas of the parks that do not have don't have dangerous levels of contamination.
Yep. And I think this question is going to come up again when we cover the delineation part, where we show where we believe the waste is located. And then there are some other areas, but one of the slides in here, it says that, we're keeping the parks closed until the investigation is complete. And until that investigation is complete, we need to make sure that these other areas are not unsafe as well. And once I get into those delineation reports, I'll be able to explain it better. But what we're trying to prevent at this point is relocate a playground from an area that's over the exposed waste into an area that we feel is safe and clear, only to find out from the investigations later that there's something else that's contaminating that area. So we're trying to protect everyone and make sure that once we do this, once we go through and we recommend a remedial action, what we're going to do for this, that we're going to protect, that everyone's going to be protected going forward. We don't want to make mistakes and have, say that an area is okay, and then to find out later during the investigation that it's not. And I know Ryan and Kevin can elaborate on that once we get to the delineation section as well.
Okay.
But
Yeah, we've already got several questions related to the testing areas adjacent to the park. They'll save for the next section. Is there at this point any remediation timeline that you can discuss?
I'll take a crack at this, and then I may need Ryan or Kevin to kind of come in. But and again, when we go through the delineation, we'll kind of explain why this may be a moving target. No one wants to hear that you have a hard date, but then the date starts to move. So what we proposed at the last meeting, we said we were going to do the full investigations at each one of the 5 parks for all those different media types that I talked about, for the groundwater, the soil gas. And then we're going to do a couple rounds of sampling to make sure we really have our arms around the data and we understand what's out there. Where that can be a slippery slope and it can extend is when we get the waste going up to a property boundary, and then we need to get access to that property boundary, because we can't fully remediate the site until we know where the waste is all located. So if it goes off-site, we need to track that down. We need to do investigations on those parcels to make sure that they're safe as well. So that's it's, I hate to use it as like a moving target to say that this could possibly extend, but in the interest of making sure that we get all the chemicals covered and all the hazards covered, it potentially could. I don't know, Ryan, Kevin, if you want to mention something there, or if we want to talk about that later.
And it also includes the groundwater delineation and any vapors that we would have to delineate as well. So that's what can really add significant time to a standard schedule. I guess
Could
not
there
that
be
we have.
vapors? Could there be vapors in areas that don't have any existing contamination in the soil?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, there could be vapors
Yeah.
beyond the delineated waste boundary.
Landfill gases typically follow the path of least resistance. So in a covered landfill like you have today, the city dumps, they put an engineered cap over that waste. And that cap is designed to allow those gases to be trapped, and then they're funneled through a ventilation system where they can be pumped out and treated. These old pre-reg landfills did not have any type of a cap system. So those gases for years and years have off-gassed and come out of the soil, and if they're present, we're still in the process of determining whether or not these landfill gases are present. Not to get ahead of myself, but in incinerator type waste, when the waste is burned off, a lot of those chemicals that would produce landfill gases are also burned off. So again, until we get the investigations done and we know for sure, we don't know. So I'm talking about general landfill gases. But what they do is they follow that path of least resistance. So if you have a very hard soil and then you have a sandy vein of soil, the gases can take that path, or they could follow the path of a utility that goes through the waste. If there's a water line or something that runs through the waste, those gases will go to that line. They could travel along that utility and come out many feet to hundreds of feet away from the waste disposal area. So that's what Ryan's saying. Like when we do this landfill gas assessment, and we do it in a few different parts, we'll be able to identify where the landfill gases could potentially be over the waste, and then we'll move out and make sure they're not getting to the homes surrounding the properties.
Great. One additional question is, I understand that the city has set aside $5 million with another potential $7 million for remediation and related efforts. Could some of those funds, is the intention that some of those funds be used to create interim recreation areas or playgrounds where those existing playgrounds that have now been closed maybe for a couple of years could be built nearby, or some sort of, clean area adjacent could be used for alternative recreation sites while larger remediation efforts are underway?
Yeah, I suppose that's a possibility. I don't know that we can answer that question. I think that's more of a question for the city and how that money's been allocated and how they're going to be able to spend that funding. I'm not sure.
Mr. Chavis, thank you. We'll follow up with that. Mr. Chavis, did you have?
Yes,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I have my question because I like what that other young lady said. 4 years? It hasn't been 4 years. It's been many years. Our recreation center has been closed for many years. Beside that building has been a contaminated building. And we have asked the city over and over. This is why my question is so important. I know about that sanitation part, but I also want to know who is looking into how can mold also plays a part in helping to cause body harm to children and to other people, because we had 2 buildings there that was declared mold, and the city of Durham knew about it and still went from one across the street park to another park and added little things for children to play on. And we told them that should not have happened. This is my concern. And I hope if in your determination that how can we get also other types of determination that can cause problems along with what y'all are doing? Do you feel that it need to be other types of samples being taken along with y'all samples to make sure that it is not added into, or it is adding into it? So that's my question.
Yeah, I think anything that beyond what we would cover in this program, which would be the landfill, waste samples, groundwater, landfill vapors, anything beyond that, as far as any structures or buildings, I think that would be a question we'd have to take back to the city or county health department, because that's beyond the scope of this program.
Are you asking us citizens also to help you? Because as you know, when that building has mold outside and it rains and stuff like that, that water travels. And that's been our concern. The mold wasn't just inside, the mold was outside too.
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have an answer for you. I mean, I just know that's kind of more probably health department question or something that they might be able to help with. I mean, we don't do any mold testing with the assessment in this program.
It's definitely a valid concern. It's just outside of our
Sure.
area. Yeah.
Then tell me, who can we get to do that? Because with y'all part and this part being left undone, we're not getting our full benefit. We need
Yeah,
all this to be considered. Your part, and if it needs to take someone else to do that part, because you're saying, I know about my parcel and I know the ditches and cuts. Water runs down. Water does not run up. And if water hit mold, it travels downward too. So this is what I'm trying to find out. Do we need to also make sure from your end, what you're telling us today, that mold is not considered in this,
Yes.
that we need to go and get someone else to get them require some more help for y'all to determine that mold?
yes, sir. I guess I'd recommend starting with that first slide, that information for the state Health and Human Services group. And I think that's an occupational epidemiology group.
Mhm.
So those folks should be able to help answer those questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Um, there's a question that just popped up in the chat and then several more that people submitted at registration, but I think let's hear more about delineation and then we'll have another round of questions, which might make more sense for us to wait for the next part. Thanks.
Okay. Good deal. So we're going to talk about the waste now. You know, we talked about the playgrounds, and then the whole reason the playgrounds came up. When we started our investigations, several of the playgrounds were still open. So we had folks out in the field collecting soil samples. And then when we would get to the playgrounds, there were kids playing. We didn't want to, sample around the kids. So we kind of worked around those areas. And at the time, since we were identifying waste around those playgrounds, we kind of made some assumptions that, hey, there's waste here. When we get to the mapping section, we'll include the playgrounds. But on one of the later calls, one of the residents brought up a point, say, do we know for sure if there's waste beneath the playgrounds? So we kind of went backwards there from what we typically would have done with a landfill that was brought to us. So we focused on sampling those playgrounds. So that's kind of why we talked about the playgrounds first. But really, when we look at these sites, we look at these old landfills, we're looking at what they call the waste disposal area, the WDA, and that's the footprint of where the waste goes and how far it extends out. In some cases, it can extend out past the property boundary. In some cases, it's confined to the property boundary. It really depends on where they spread the waste at the time. And again, we're trying to figure that out now when it happened back in the 40s and 50s. The waste I mentioned, it's consistent of brick, glass, and these are the physical hazards to the park users. So if there's not a good foot of soil cover over that waste, some of that waste can be exposed, and that's where your hazards exist, in addition to the chemicals. This is just a statement on pre-reg landfills. So they're unlined and unregulated, and I mentioned that earlier, that typical regulated facilities have engineered caps over them. These facilities do not. And with that, they also do not have records of the types of waste that went into the landfills. There could be hazardous waste, medical waste, asbestos containing materials. Now, that's what our investigations are trying to determine. But based on the history of the site, knowing that they were incinerator landfills, we don't believe that a lot of these materials are still going to be present in the form that we'd be able to identify them with. But it's important to note that they could be present. Also, the heterogeneous nature of these landfills, again, they weren't put in one big lump. They could have been trucked in, covered. Nothing happened for years. They went back and added more. So we really don't know. We're trying to put that puzzle together and identify where this boundary is. So when we do this on these larger sites, we don't have the resources to sample every foot or every 10 feet. So we try and generalize in some cases. We do different techniques to identify where this waste is. And we use all those tools to paint a picture. Once we get that picture painted, we can go back and sample and collect the samples that are necessary to identify the hazards to the best of our capabilities. So delineation, this is where we go and we try and find the waste itself. Why is this important? Well, the pre-regulatory landfill program itself has to follow state statutes and requirements. And those include identifying, inventorying, and monitoring all the inactive hazardous substances or waste disposal sites. So that's why we need to identify where that waste is first. It's a main requirement of this program. Once we have the boundary delineated, we can identify where those contaminants are. Once we can identify where the contaminants are, they will be put on a notice of environmental contamination that'll be linked to the property. And we kind of talk about those a little bit here. So here, the pre-reg landfill waste was used as fill material. It doesn't appear that it was just buried and covered. It looks like it could have been put in low spots to fill voids in the property. Our investigation process is outlined in the guidance document, and we try and identify the waste areas and where the contamination's migrating away from the landfill. I mentioned before, now that we're trying to identify the ends of the waste, we can sample these other media types, the groundwater, the surface water, and the vapors. So we've identified waste at various properties and boundaries, suggesting that the presence of the waste goes beyond the properties. And I'm going to get to those in a minute. I'm going to go through site maps for each one of the parks, and I'll show you where we've identified waste and where we believe there's a possibility that it could go off site. The next step in this, and this will also help with our timeline and speeding things up, we're trying to identify the residential properties that could be affected by this waste. We can't just go onto someone's property. In order to access their property and do our investigation, we need to get access. We need to give them an access request form that they can fill out and give back to us. And we'll get into what that means a little bit later. But that's where we can kind of speed up this process. If we're able to identify all these particular properties that may have waste, the sooner we can get on the property, the sooner we can identify the contaminants, the faster we can wrap up the investigation. This is really just a site map kind of indicating what it would look like in the end. This is a landfill that was closed out a while ago, and you can see the property boundary, and this is the delineated waste boundary, and it's clear that this site is nowhere near the adjacent residential properties. So that's when we really have our arms around the site. We know where the waste is, and then we can document. Excuse me? Oh, all right. This is also a link to the Division of Waste Management site locator tool. You can go to this website, or also put a QR code in here if you want to scan that QR code.
Somebody bring me the QR.
And you can see all of the landfills that are located across the state of North Carolina. At the end of our investigation, once we propose a remedial action, we'll put together this notice of environmental contamination. And what this is going to do, we're going to have a summary report, which will summarize the findings of all of the sampling that we've done. And then we'll have this map to kind of present to show the extents of where the waste is located, and then all of the contaminants that are identified throughout the investigation process. And this will remain with the property going forward. So I want to talk about the waste a little bit and why this waste was harder than most to identify. I think I mentioned this in the last presentation that we did. Because this waste has the consistency of soil, when we're drilling down into the waste, it's really hard to identify exactly where it's at because it looks like the soil around it. From these pictures, you can see this is clear. You can see a couple feet of clean fill above the waste, and then it's the black incinerator ash with glass and fragments. Here, it was spread out. You can only see it through this trench, and you can see it's under about a foot of usable soil cover, but then there's 2 or 3 inches of this waste. So it's taken us some time to try and find these waste boundaries, and these are the many tools that we've used to identify where the waste extends to. So that's another reason why this has taken a little bit longer. We did not want to stop with just a couple borings and say that this is the edge of the waste, when we could go a little bit further and prove for a fact that the waste did not extend. And I know there were a couple public questions about waste going on to adjacent properties, and our maps will kind of cover that. It was really important for us. In the beginning, when we started drilling these sites, you would see a couple fragments of glass, but no incinerator waste with it. And so we were like, well, typically if this is our landfill investigation, we'd call this waste. But once we got into these sites and you could see the waste and what the incinerator ash really looks like, then we could go back to those previous borings and say, okay, well, this is broken glass bottles from the park, from people drinking, throwing their bottles and breaking and being covered with a couple inches of soil. So that's what's taken us some time to kind of really refine these areas. So I'm going to go through these one at a time. And what I'm going to do for each one, I'm kind of going to show where the waste extends to, and then where we've reached out for public access in order to access these adjacent properties. So this is the East Durham site. We had a really clear delineation line coming on this side of the property. We believe the waste goes underneath the road. And so this parcel here on the corner, we wanted to get access to that property just to make sure that there was not a sliver of the waste going onto the property. Over here, there's an apartment complex. It was pretty apparent that the waste came right up to the property boundary and made us feel that the waste could extend over into that apartment complex. So we asked for access to that property. This one was really just kind of cutting off the edge of the waste here. Again, we believe it probably remains on the site. We had a bunch of borings over on this part of the property with some trenches, and we had no indications of waste at all. But we want to just clear this property just to be sure. And a lot of the access agreements that we're asking for, it's not that we really feel that the waste is there, it's that we want to exclude it. And so if we check those boxes and we can make sure that the waste isn't there, then we can close off that investigation path. This is the Lion Park, and this is an example of how inconsistent that this waste is. So the incinerator for Lion Park was located up here on the Armory property. And you can tell from the waste, this is a very steep slope on the back of the property. So the waste, we believe, was pushed over the back of the slope, maybe to fill in a swale that was there previously. And then over here, it appears when they were building the playground, the baseball field, that they used it as fill to fill up that property and flatten the property. And then we had this little outlier down here. You know, we thought we had no indications of waste throughout this area, but when we got down to the playgrounds, we ran into, in some cases, 2 to 4 feet of waste here, and then 0 to 3 feet of waste here. So the waste was really thin in this area, but again, we don't know why. We just identified it through the investigation. This is the East End Park. And so this is where all the tennis courts and playgrounds are located. And then we also went out beyond the Duke investigation, and we investigated the park across the street. And so we had identified another section of the waste disposal area here. And then again, a little pocket that we really couldn't explain, but it's there. The waste also extends down here to the south onto the city's paint shop property. Now here we asked for access across this is the stream that borders the property to the north, and it also borders the property to the east. We believe in what we typically see in these pre-reg landfills, the waste is usually pushed up to the surface water because it was probably a low spot in the property. Because we had thick waste along this area here, we also wanted to investigate the properties on the other side of the creek. Again, not because we believe that the waste goes over there, but just to exclude them. So we've asked for access to these properties to the north. And then I think that's it for this property, really. It was the properties that bound it to the north. We had a clean delineation here, distance between that and the surface water. And then we had several borings on the steep slope over here on the adjacent property and had no indications of waste. Walltown Park. Walltown, as you know, almost the entire parcel is covered in waste. We had a clean delineation on the east side of the site, and that's probably related to the building construction itself. We're assuming that when the building was put in, there was probably waste there, could have been removed. We don't know. But the waste along the western property boundary, we sampled right up to, there's a small sliver, and I know you can hardly tell in this figure, but there's a small sliver of city-owned property in between here, and we went and put borings just to see how far we could go without going onto those adjacent properties. And we had indications of waste right here. It's hard to tell on this figure, on this scale. You can tell more clearly in our reports that the waste does get very thin here. So we believe that it probably tapers off and stops before it goes too far into these backyards. but we want to know for sure. So we're asking for access to all the adjacent properties on this western side of the site so we can make sure that these properties are free of waste. And Northgate, we mentioned that this is the one site that does not have an incinerator. The old historical records, and I could be off on my numbers a little bit, I think they indicated that 150 truckloads of waste were brought into this area. As you can tell from this map, the waste is very thin. There's not a lot of waste out here. In this small section near the playground, it gets a little thicker, but in general, it's 0 to a half a foot across the entire area. And if you kind of crunch the numbers on this section of waste, it comes out to about 6,000 cubic yards of waste. If you kind of do the math on that to the size of trucks that they would have been using in the 1940s and 50s, which would have been smaller in size than we use today, it lines up pretty well with 150 truckloads. So based on our investigation, we believe that this is the extent of the waste at Northgate. You can see these blue borings here that we actually had no indications of waste. But then as we got closer to the church property here across the street, we ran into a lot of utilities and we weren't able to really get a lot of clean samples to make sure. Again, we're not sure if it goes across the street, but we've asked for access to these properties. This one, the church, and then all the properties that border it to the east on this side. I think this slide, we kind of covered this before. You asked about how soon the landfill or how soon the parks can be reopened once we get the investigation complete. And I mentioned that that timeline really depends on the factors of one, how soon we can get all the assessment work completed and then access to these surrounding properties. So it's really important that we get access to these properties. I don't think I have a slide for this, but we have reached out to all these property owners. They've been mailed letters requesting with 2 copies of the access agreement form, detailed information about the program, and then contact information so they can reach out to us before they sign and send it and ask questions. And then this public forum is another way for you to ask questions. And I'm sure that we'll have a lot of questions about what those access agreements mean. Someone mentioned the remediation cost estimates. Early on in the program, we put together at the city's request kind of a generic cost estimate for how much it would take to clean up the park sites. At the time, we were looking at the small footprint of the waste that was previously identified by the Duke grad student and another consultant to kind of come up, if this is the only place that the waste is located, what would it generally cost? So we crunched those numbers and that's where we came up with that estimate. I believe it was near $11 million for all 5 parks. I want to note that because as our investigation expanded and we went at East End across the street into the park, several other locations at Northgate and Lyon, that cost is obviously going to increase. So I think we talk about this in a later slide that we will revisit those cost estimates once we get done with our investigation to have a more accurate cost of what it would take to clean up these sites. This just explains the risk-based remedy that the program uses. We record land use restrictions and notice of environmental contamination. I showed that map earlier it'll show where all the contaminants are located. We would go in and remove all of the trees that are located over the waste disposal area. If there are any stream banks, like Walltown basically has a stream running through the center of the waste disposal area. We would stabilize those stream banks and then we would cover them with 12 inches of clean soil. We call it a vegetated soil cover. It's not a cap. It doesn't protect in a hard way. It's a dermal protection. It gives 12 inches of soil cover to prevent exposure to the waste. Mentioned the access agreement letters. Again, these have already been sent out. What these access agreements will do, they'll allow us to get onto the property and do the same thing we're doing on the city's property. We're trying to identify the delineation extents. We may do some soil sampling. If there's waste on that property, we may do landfill gas or groundwater sampling. And this helps us establish the site. once we have that site, like I said, then we can kind of rein in all the contaminants and we know exactly where things are. We can put forward a remedial action plan for each site. We have a sub slide in here, participating in the pre-reg landfill program. This just really details what the program is, what the landfill program is, and what we do. It takes state funds from the Inactive Hazardous Sites Cleanup Fund to investigate and design some kind of a remedial action for these pre-regulatory landfills. Like I said, part of that remedial action is to put a vegetated soil cover over it, so that's a little repetitive. And then recorded institutional controls. That's where at the end of once the soil cover is installed, installing signs, letting people know that the property is contaminated, protecting the current and future uses of the property by putting that dermal protection over the landfill. See, what is this one? If the property owner does not agree to testing, okay. So I think we're going to talk about this a little bit too when we get into the access agreement basis, and I'm sure there's going to be questions. There may be homeowners that do not want us to investigate on their property, and then we're going to kind of talk about what that means and what can be done in those instances.
Can you clarify what you mean by dermal barrier before moving on from this slide?
Yeah. So right now, and you can see this in some of the parks and in our first two reports that we previously talked about where we sampled the soil cover, the whole intent of that was to sample it for chemicals to make sure that there are no chemicals of hazardous levels in that top 12 inches of the soil cover. But it's also to see if there was a 12-inch barrier between the waste and the public. So DEQ in our guidance document, it provides, and Ryan and Kevin can kind of explain this in greater detail, that 12 inches of soil cover is a suitable barrier to protect from exposure to that glass, brick, all the other materials that are located. And I didn't mention it because we don't want to get into all the details of the construction of that barrier. But one thing it doesn't mention, that there's a geosynthetic fabric that once the waste is uncovered, the fabric goes over the waste, and then the 12 inches of soil cover is built on top of that. What that does, you have that 12 inches of soil cover, and you're going to assume that the city is going to take care of this for the next 30, 40, 50 years and make sure that that barrier doesn't reduce in its thickness. That orange barrier is kind of a visual barrier. If there was a run out area, a washed out area, a big storm or something like that, you would see that orange fabric and it would be a visual indicator that, hey, there's waste here. Or if someone ignored the property restrictions and went out and started digging into the soil cover barrier and they hit that fabric, it's clearly written on the fabric, do not dig, waste disposal area. So it's just more another step to prevent exposure to the waste. I hope I answered.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I think that wraps up kind of the presentation. So again, we're open for question and answers, and I know we're gonna have a few here.
Yeah, again, I'll ask people to either raise their hands or put their question in the chat. I think we can go back to the question from earlier, which was, can you talk more about the testing on residential property? What happens if residents say don't give permission, and if contamination is found, do you know anything about the legal requirements of homeowners having to sort of make those disclosures if they need to sell their home?
No, I don't. Unfortunately, we can't speak to any of the legal implications, but I think the slide that we included explaining the programs, trying to capture the benefits of participating. So if you agree to give the state access permission, and then we can do the investigation on all the residential properties, that will tell us if there's waste present, if groundwater contamination, vapor impacts. We have numerous sites that landfills are on residential property, and we have to put vapor mitigation systems on homes or businesses. There's contaminated drinking water wells that we have to put treatment systems on. We pay for all of that by participating in the program. So I think by not giving access permission and knowing where the landfill's at and being part of the remedy, then you're going to miss out on that. And I think that's just a serious consideration to think of, that the benefit of having the program pay for everything. Then if you do have waste on your property, once that risk-based remedy is completed, then you at least know where everything's at. You have that dermal barrier installed. The institutional controls that are recorded on your deed, then that helps identify the risks and concerns that were part of the investigation. And then moving forward, that's just known and documented for future users.
Will there be any way to for people to have their property tested and it be anonymous?
No, I mean, everything we do is a public record. So once you give us access permission and give us an opportunity to come on your property, everything's going to be included in our reports and is available for public viewing.
There were a couple of concerns about tree removal. You talked about that a little bit. Is there any way to get around that and leave some of those adult trees?
Possibly. We have talked to arborists in the past. I know this has come up at other sites, and what we have been told is that if you have a mature tree that's still fairly young and healthy in the life cycle, and you put 12 inches of soil on top of the roots in the drip zone, that could kill the tree. So there's no way to get that 12-inch dermal barrier on top of the waste when the tree's inside the waste disposal area. So that's why we recommend complete tree removal in that delineated waste boundary. Also, then moving forward, when a storm hits or the tree gets to the end of the life cycle and falls over, that root ball is going to come up and pull waste up with it. And now you're going to have exposed waste, and the state's not there. I mean, we've moved on to the next landfill. So that's why the recommendation for all tree removal, the recorded land use restrictions for properties that have waste require maintenance. So a minimum of mowing that grass cover twice a year. And that's to avoid any future woody vegetation from getting established on top of the landfill.
So no new trees or bushes can replace the trees that have to be removed in this scenario.
There's opportunity for residential landscaping, some small shrubs, but those then would be in raised beds. But I think there is opportunity for options like that. We have told other local governments with parks and similar sites like this that if they wanted to retain a few large trees, then they have to agree to the maintenance. So when that tree falls over and waste is exposed, then the local government has to pay for all of the waste handling, disposal, and then getting that barrier established in that where the tree was formerly.
So no, Matt, just to a couple more follow-up questions. It sounds like this would mean removing trees in all of the parks, in the contaminated areas of the parks with with dangerous levels of toxics. So is that a true? And if so, is there any other type of remediation method that would preserve existing trees or allow the planting of new trees?
So this would be trees that are inside that delineated waste disposal area. So the figures so right here, we're all looking at Walltown.
Yeah.
Or any of these. So this orange polygon any tree that's inside that area would be removed in order to install the 12-inch soil cover. If it's outside, and there's a little bit of a buffer, so when we do this work, there's a buffer around the delineated waste area called the limits of disturbance. So that could be 30 to 50 feet, and that's the erosion control permit and silt fence that has to go in. But we try to minimize the amount of trees that need to be removed that are outside of that waste disposal area boundary. As far as other technologies, I'm not aware of any, just beyond the option of retaining as few mature trees as possible. But again, that's a decision that the landfill owner has to make, because they would need to agree to maintenance and future financial expenditures when that tree needs to be removed.
Thank you. Without considering legal implications, logistically, what happens if a resident doesn't voluntarily agree to provide access to their property for this testing? Can DEQ ever come to testing by right or without the property owner's consent?
We do have authority to get an administrative warrant, which would allow us access to the property to collect samples. Yeah, hopefully that answered your question.
I think so. If not, people can post follow up in the chat. So we talked about some where it overlaps onto private property. What about in cases where people live in those apartments that are right up that next to that that area of the park that has high contamination, and areas where I think it's that same park that's also right up next to an elementary school. What are the plans? Like, what is happening now to ensure that children and other residents of that area aren't exposed to live in those apartments or attend that school? And what are those areas being prioritized?
East Durham Park.
Yeah, so this is East Durham here. So I told you we requested access to these three parcels. One is that apartment complex, this parcel here, and this parcel here. And the intent is when we get access, and we have received access, part of our investigation is to go over there and install additional borings, groundwater sampling points, landfill gas points, to see if there are indications of waste and contamination on those properties as well. So that's what this next round of sampling is going to do. Once we get access from the property owners, we can go over and do more of what we did here to delineate the extents of the waste, and then also install those sampling points. I know it's not on this map, but I can visualize that we have groundwater monitoring wells all around the perimeter of this landfill. And once we get access, and I believe we already have access to these two properties here, the installation of the monitor wells and gas probes on those properties to look for contamination.
I think this is probably out of your scope, but do you know if those apartments and those schools has there been communication with them about this danger?
Well, in this particular landfill, the apartment complex received a letter that Jerry spoke about, and they provided access permission. So as of now, there's several soil gas probes that were installed near that building, and we're collecting samples. So that information will be shared with them once we have multiple. I mean, as we do this, each round is then evaluated, but there's multiple sampling events to determine if that building is okay. Same thing with the school. So between the school property and the delineated waste disposal area boundary, there's soil gas probes. Well, I'll back up just a second. So we start in the waste. So we'll put landfill gas probes in the waste first to see if there's any vapors in the waste. If there are vapors, then we step out beyond the delineated boundary and continue to work our way out until we find the end of that vapor area that's impacted. So the school may be okay. We don't know right now. We're still in the phase of landfill gas probes in the waste. But as we step out, the communication expands with that process if need be.
There were some follow-up questions to the legal process about testing. Diane, are you able to unmute and ask those follow-up questions?
Yeah, it was just the follow-up to the testing where voluntary consent isn't provided by the property owner. I think the response was that yes, DEQ has the ability to do what an administrative warrant, I think is what you said. So I was just wondering
Yes.
if you can explain what an administrative warrant is so folks can, so we can think about what the choices are around voluntary consent or facing whatever that might be.
I might need to get that information and share that with you at our next meeting. I'm not sure that I can describe that to you or walk you through that, but it's
Ryan, this is Delonda. I can answer a little bit of that
okay.
question.
Thank you.
The administrative warrant, we go to I'm Delonda Alexander. I'm the branch manager over the PRLF program. We go to the local magistrate. We present the information and our documentation saying that there could be contamination present that's either impacting human health or the environment. So we lay out our reasoning, and then the magistrate will decide to grant us or not an administrative warrant, which then allows us to go to the property with a sheriff that serves a warrant that says we are allowed to enter the property. The warrant is good for 24 hours, so we can do the sampling that we can do in a 24-hour period while we're there. If we have to do more sampling that goes beyond 24 hours, we go back to the magistrate the next day and get another warrant. So we can keep doing that for 24-hour periods every day, every day, every day, if we so choose. Our goal is always to just get the minimum amount of information that we need to make sure that everyone is safe and protected. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Thanks. I might have some more questions about that, but I'll wait about that. But I appreciate that explanation.
Going back to something you said a while, like at the beginning of the second part, you talked about the original remediation cost estimates. Can you just talk a little bit more about what? So we understand. So I think the sort of lower end option is the cap and cover, where the areas with high levels of contamination as distinct from just waste, but like dangerous contamination that's a danger to human health, would be covered with a thick layer of plastic and that couldn't be disturbed. Are there other, and so in those areas, no trees could be planted, no benches or playground equipment could be there with that type of remediation. What type did you all price out full remediation? Is that part of the 11 million? And does 11 million feel like a likely underestimate at this point?
If we did not price out full removal of waste at the time that original cost estimate was put together, we didn't have the waste delineation completed. So we didn't know how much waste was at each of the parks. So the estimate that this program will provide and the proposed remedy would be a risk-based remedy, and it would follow that slide that showed recording the institutional controls, removing trees, installing that 12-inch soil cover system, and then posting signs. There's maintenance requirements and an annual certification. So that's what we can offer for these types of landfills that are in this program. If there's interest in source removal, then when we're done with the investigation, in addition to that risk-based cost, we can also produce a cost for complete waste removal. We did that for Bingham Park in Greensboro. So we could provide that too. Then whatever the difference is, and what we're doing in Greensboro is we're providing the amount of money to cover the risk-based cost for that entire landfill. The cities decided to do kind of a hybrid approach. They're doing source removal for a portion of the landfill and then a cover on the larger portion of the landfill. So I think the total for that was about 20 million. I think our estimate for complete waste removal for the entire landfill, which was about 250 to 300,000 cubic yards of waste, was I think about $40 million. So it gets really expensive with the removal, transportation, disposal, and then backfilling with clean soil to fill the hole that's left in the ground. So when we're done with the sorry, go ahead.
Sure, I was just going to say, could you see, I mean, a differentiated approach to these 5 different parks where perhaps a couple of them have small areas with dangerous levels of contamination, but other parks have more vast areas? Can you see perhaps a hybrid approach working in Durham, where there's some full remediation of entire parks or areas of parks, and some cap and cover in smaller or underused areas?
I think for this program, each landfill for the 5 parks, we would provide that cost for a risk-based remedy, which is the cover system. So even at Northgate, with the smallest amount of waste at 6 or 7,000 cubic yards, that's still going to be many millions of dollars for source removal. So we have seen in the years past in the program that removing a ton of waste material, a lot of times it's saturated, so you're paying even extra for the material when it's wet. But removal, transportation, and disposal of material from these landfills is extremely expensive. I don't know off the top of my head if I could give you an estimate, or a multiplier from the cover system to source removal. But I think even at Northgate, if it were $1 million for the cover system, it could be 2 or 3 times that much to remove that material. So there again, that would be one we would estimate the cost for the risk-based remedy, and then we could do source removal, but that difference then would be the responsibility of the city, the landfill owner.
I see. So DEQ has funds even in 2025 with the strict pulling back of funds for things like this to do the most basic risk-based remedy. And then if city wants to do more, the city can find other ways of funding that. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, so we get about 12 million a year in tax revenue. So 50% of the solid waste disposal tax is sent to this program to pay for the investigation and risk-based remedial work.
Okay. And I understand that there are hundreds of parks that need remediation. Where would these 5 Durham parks rank on that list?
I don't know off the top of my head the numbers. We've prioritized them as far as the risk priority, and I can get that for you. I don't have that in front of me, but the investigation, we're prioritizing all 5 of the investigations. That's been ongoing since we had these enter the program. So I think when we're done with the investigation and we have these updated cost estimates for the 2 options, if that's what everybody wants to see, then at that point, that's when we can really look at the timeline and available funding to see how soon each of these could be funded for that remediation. So we do have dozens of other sites kind of going through the same process as these 5 parks, the investigation and the remedy. And then when they're done and that remedial action plan is completed, we have to go through public comment period. So that's a 60-day publication of the plan. And then if we get any comments from folks, then we have to have a public hearing. But then we also have permitting, and that adds a significant amount of time. So a couple of these parks have surface water features that pretty much cut through the entire landfill. So that's going to add time with all the different permitting agencies that'll be involved in the approvals that we'll need to stabilize those stream banks and allow us to disturb that area. And we do that with all, most of these sites. It's just could take 12 or, I don't know, 6 to 12 months additional time after the public comment period, even for permitting.
Hmm. Well, it's very helpful to have that information about what y'all are able to do. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Sure.
Any final questions or comments? I hope I've gotten to all of the ones in the chat, and I think I've gotten to, I think, almost all of the ones that people submitted when they registered. I'm not seeing or hearing anything further, so I just want to thank you all again for your willingness to meet with us and answer all of these questions. And we look forward to engaging with you more for information sharing going forward. Thank you, everyone, for your time tonight, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.